Welcome everyone to this Bright Blue event in partnership with SSE Thermal. My name is Patrick Hall and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue. This event is titled Capturing Net Zero, the Role of Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage. Before we get into introductions for the key questions and our speakers today, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be live tweeting this event on our Twitter account. Our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue. You can also follow SSE Thermal. Their Twitter handle is @SSE Thermal, all one word. If you would like to tweet about this event, please do so using the hashtag #BrightBlue, all one word, lowercase. You can also ask questions and put those to the panel via Slido. The link can be found below this live stream video. You can also ask us questions via Twitter, again using the hashtag #BrightBlue. So I will now introduce our key speakers and our key questions. Today we are asking, will carbon capture, utilisation and storage technologies be central to achieving net zero 2050? What are the challenges associated with building industrial CCUS clusters? Should CCUS be utilised primarily within hard-to-abate sectors? And how can the government help to ensure CCUS projects come to fruition? So speaking to these points and more today is our excellent panel of speakers. We have Lord Duncan, who is Deputy Speaker in the House of Lords and was formerly Minister for Climate Change. We have Dr. Grazia Leonzio, who is a Research Associate at Imperial College London. We have Torbjørg Klara Fossum, who is the Vice President of Global CCS Solutions at Equinor. And we have John Johnson, who is a Director of Development at SSE Thermal. So thank you all for our great panel of speakers for joining us today. I'm going to give you 7 minutes for your introductory remarks, and I'll hand over first to Lord Duncan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me begin at the beginning. Carbon capture and storage works. So that's the first thing that we have to appreciate. It's worked for some time, but, and there is a but, it is not yet fully accepted by almost any government as a serious component part of its decarbonisation strategy. And that is the challenge that we face. And as we will all recall, over the years, there have been various attempts by governments, the UK government, by the European Commission to encourage pilot schemes to demonstrate the utility of this technology, and they all broadly fell over. So although significant monies were set aside, again, they were never deployed. And we're now at that stage where the debate has moved on quite substantially since that point in terms of what we do with hydrocarbons. And we have seen that debate here in the UK, the question of whether the Scottish field, the Camno field of Shetland should be exploited or not. The debate now is much more serious about leaving it in the ground. And so when we're looking at the challenges that come to the full deployment of CCUS, one of the greatest of all is that people are now seeing beyond hydrocarbons. Whether that is true in a realizable sense is debatable. I would argue it isn't true, but how people perceive it is the risk that we face now. And so where carbon capture and storage, had it been deployed in the last 10 years at scale in the UK, we would be having a very different debate, because we would literally be pointing at proven technology on our shores or on our continent at scale, and then explaining to people who might be reticent that this is part of the process whereby the exploitation of hydrocarbons can continue in such a fashion that we are able to mitigate the overall carbon footprint. But that hasn't happened. And indeed, to some degree, it's slightly worse than that. Quite often we have found that carbon capture and storage has been associated with the most polluting of the hydrocarbons, with, for example, in the Canadian sector, with tar sands, where there's almost a suggestion that the carbon capture and storage is allowing the exploitation of a very heavily polluting, carbon-emitting resource, and therefore it's facilitating greater pollution rather than abating the pollution which we are seeing. And so the first problem that I perceive is that we now have an issue of wider perception and understanding, and a relatively hostile community amongst those who don't know about it and might therefore be against it, and those who know a little about it but still don't like it, and a wider environmental movement who are simply vehemently opposed to it because they see it as prolonging the carbon fossil trend into the next, decades that lie before us. So the challenge I think we face is a real one. However, carbon capture and storage does work. It does work, and it does work at scale. It works best when it is in close to the point of origin of the carbon. It works best when you are looking at light hydrocarbons, not heavy hydrocarbons, for obvious reasons. Again, the perception of the public is that you want to be looking to abate gas rather than abating the tar sands. And equally, the notion now again of trying to find ways of clustering. So whereas before there was a suggestion these were individual enterprises, individual power stations dissociated from other places, now there's a recognition that that's not the sensible way of doing it, to cluster. And clustering has an advantage because clustering by its nature suggests jobs, it suggests growth, it suggests something fresh and new, which will be an economic advantage. And that, to a government's ears, is very popular indeed. I think we will see in the next 5 years the make or break moment in the UK for carbon capture and storage at scale. And that is where the government has a significant responsibility. If I were being slightly critical of the government, and I'm not desperately trying to be critical of the government, but their leadership in this area and in other areas of, let's call it the COP agenda, has not been quite what has been expected. We're still waiting for the building heating strategy, for example, to come out. And we are really now on the very last moments of the glide path toward COP. There will need to be clear government direction on this beyond what has been thus far given. And there will need to be a recognition of investment in this area. If you look at all of the statements from the UN, they recognize that CC, CCUS, CCS are integral to our decarbonising. But it's now up to governments to interpret that in a meaningful way. And I suspect, unless we can actually do so at a government level, it will be very hard to be driven forward by the individual companies or the individual operators or the individual power stations themselves. And I think that will be the greatest challenge of all. Because as we're seeing now with the various challenges of literally just almost keeping the lights on, with the gas price spike, with the becalmed renewables, then we have a serious issue of trying to work out how to, at cost, ensure that people are able to have their energy needs met. And if you were to think about it now, the carbon price has been continuing to climb. That is a good thing. So my clock is going to chime completely out of sequence here. If you think about this being done at a scale, then we are going to have greater challenges going forward because, in essence, carbon capture and storage clearly has a part to play, but no one has quite set out how it shall play that role. I would anticipate, if we're looking at what emerges from COP, I had hoped there would be a spike, not a spike, a growth, a trend in the carbon price that would have, again, pushed us ever closer toward the point at which carbon capture, utilization, storage becomes an integral part of the overall mix. And we're still far off. We're not quite there by any means, but the trend is very clear. The carbon price is rising. But until it gets to that point at which it becomes absolutely integral to the planned projects, then it's very difficult to see it being deployed. Equally, to deploy it just now, when you are looking at such challenges just in terms of the wider cost of electricity, then you've got an even more significant problem. And it's not just in the UK that problem rests. You see that again in the German situation, where they are having removed nuclear from their mix. The risk they face is that in order to try and maintain prices, they have to revert to brown coal. Well, we need to have a stable price that allows investment to work. And we need a stable price to ensure that we can manage the integration of carbon capture, utilization, storage into the system. If it's a volatile price, it becomes much more unpredictable whether indeed that is cost effective or will be deployed. And I think in the absence of that, we are going to be in a bit of trouble. It may well be that the COP gathering, if it is successful, I put the word if in capital letters, if it is successful, you might see the trend in the carbon price continuing. There will be, I think, further reforms of the trading schemes. The EU will continue to reform its trading scheme. The UK, I think, is minded now to do the same. There may well be linkages between the two schemes in years to come. That would be a sensible approach. Not quite there yet. But there needs to be a stable price on which to build the carbon capture and utilization rollout. Without that, it will be very difficult indeed to see how you could then start thinking 5, 10, 15 years ahead. So I don't want to be overly negative. I think the important thing here is it's quite clear it's needed. It's quite clear it works. It's quite clear it can be deployed and can be deployed at scale. The missing link is it happening in any of those categories. And the landscape that lies before us is anything but conducive to serious investment in anything at the moment. And that, I think, is perhaps one of the greatest challenges of all. Anyone who can see over the horizon will almost certainly make great, well, either great profits or great progress. But at the moment, I think, unfortunately for most of us, trying to understand what lies ahead is particularly problematic. And I will stop there, I hope, a little bit ahead of time. But I think that might be a useful starter.
Thank you very much, Lord Duncan, and some interesting reflections there around carbon pricing and also the challenge of public perceptions of CCUS and public hostility. And I was also particularly interested in your reflections around the government not fully recognising this within their own decarbonisation strategies and perhaps some underwhelming leadership when it comes to CCUS. I'll hand over now to Dr. Grazia. The floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I have a short presentation. Can I show my screen?
Certainly, sure.
Can you allow to me to show my screen? Okay. Okay, do you see my screen?
We do, yeah.
Good morning to everyone. Regarding the role of carbon capture, utilization in solar system, I'm talking about the emerging direct air capture technology investigating in our research with a literature review and analysis of key performance indicators. We have started our research considering two problems. One, CO2 must be captured from the air with the direct air capture technology. The captured CO2 must be stored or even used. The second problem is that there is a wide range of key performance indicators values for direct air capture technologies. Then we have set 3 objectives. One, to undertake a broad analysis of the emerging DSE technologies. 2, define key performance indicator for this technology and conduct an independent analysis and understand the potential role of a DSE system in zero emissions. In this presentation, I'm going to show you carbon dioxide removal technologies and then a literature review of DSE systems. Then I'm going to show you modeling of DSE absorption processes with evaluation of their key performance indicators and then the conclusions. Carbon dioxide removal technology has an important role to limit the increase of temperature and have negative CO2 emissions. Direct air capture is one of these technology, and it was used at first to support the life in submarines and spacecraft systems. And only in 1999, it was proposed to capture CO2 from the atmosphere for greenhouse gases mitigation. There are some advantages and disadvantages of direct air capture. One advantage is that it is independent by CO2 source location, and it can capture CO2 from transport and small other sources. The main disadvantage is that CO2 parcel pressure in the air is very low, so high energy and high cost are required for the separation. There are several DSE technologies. Absorption and adsorption are the most investigated. Other technologies are pre-pilot scale. There are also other DSE companies as Carbon Engineering based on absorption. Other companies are based on adsorption. Climateworks is the most important. And another DSE company is based on ion exchange resin, that is Infinity. To compare all these technologies, DSE technologies, key performance indicators are used. Operative cost, capital cost, thermal and electrical energy consumption, environmental impact, and capture capacity are the most important and investigated. However, a wide range of their value is present in the 60 literature. Then an independent analysis is required. We conduct an independent analysis for DSE absorption system based on 3 different stages, as you can see here. This stage stages are adsorption, regeneration or desorption, and the cooling of the bed to allow another adsorption stage. Considered different sorbents as 3 different meta-organic frameworks and 2 amine-functionalized sorbents. We considered Climateworks data for the sorbent bed, and we supposed to use thermal and electric energy provided by a municipal waste incinerator as for the Climateworks plant. Here are the results of our research. We can see that we have a good agreement between Climateworks data and the system using the same sorbent, that is this, and that this sorbent is used by Climateworks in his plant. There is a good agreement for operating conditions. But we had a higher cost compared to that suggested by Climateworks, and more important, we have a negative value for climate change. In conclusion, we can see that direct air capture could effectively achieve net negative CO2 emissions. Future research should reduce cost and energy consumption for this emerging technology. And economic incentives should be provided by the government to reduce costs and help the realization of this emerging technology. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grazia. If you could just close your presentation now so that we can resume to the usual format. That was very informative about direct air capture. Thank you very much. And just a note to our viewers, a reminder that you can ask questions via Slido, the link to which can be found below this live stream, and also on Twitter. Once we've finished with the introductory remarks from our panelists, then we will move to a Q&A section where you will have an opportunity to put those questions to the panel. But now I will move next to you, Torbjørg, for 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you also for the opportunity to be part of this panel. So I work with Equinor, and I'm heading up a unit called Global CCS Solutions. And in Equinor, we have stated net zero ambitions, and we did that back in November 2020. And to reach these ambitions, CCS is one of the key building blocks. So just before summer, we also came out with some specific targets on CCS and hydrogen. And when it comes to CCS, we've stated that we aim to develop a CO2 transport and storage capacity of 15 to 30 million tons a year by 2035. And in that same period, we also aim to develop 3 to 4 major clean hydrogen projects. And I can assure you that these ambitions, they are quite significant, particularly when you consider that there is no market in place yet, as we heard Ian explaining very well. It still costs less to emit than it costs to implement these solutions. So these ambitions, they are made on a strong strategic belief that this will change. It will have to change. If the world, if UK, Norway, Europe is going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we will need CCS. And also when it comes to net zero ambitions, I mean, at the moment there are 100 nations, including China and US, that have stated that they want to get to net zero within the next 30 years. And on top of that, you see industrial players as Equinor and many others that also have stated net zero commitments. And if you look at these nations and these industries together, they represent very strong forces with a common goal of net zero. And with net zero goals, CCS is a prerequisite. So we really firmly believe that the need for CCS will grow, and it will grow fast. And we believe that UK and Norway is in a unique position to serve this need and to build business and industrial opportunity on this. If you look at the North Sea, it's one of the areas in the world with a large, very large storage capacity. And you find roughly 1/3 of that storage capacity in the UK and another 1/3 in Norway. We have a lot of data, competence, knowledge from the oil and gas business that we now apply to qualify and develop storage sites and, you know, really CCS industry. I have to come back a little bit to Lord Duncan start, which you started with CCS works, and it really does. In Norway, we have been doing offshore storage for 25 years. We started offshore storage at Sleipner in 1996. So today, or this year, we have 25 years anniversary. And this was the first offshore storage in the world. And it was for a very long time the only one. But then later we also developed Snøhvit, where you actually have a 152 kilometer long CO2 pipeline from shore to the injection point. And even today, if you look at these two projects, they represent 2 out of 3 offshore storage projects in operation. And that has given us a very unique experience. And, you know, it put us in the forefront on CCS with more than 25 years of operational experience. And we want to bring this unique experience to UK to help UK succeed, because then, you know, we will succeed in being part of building this new industry. And we really believe that UK is the place to be when developing low carbon projects. The policy support to CCS and hydrogen is in front if you compare to other places in Europe. UK is actually leading the way, even if we sometimes should have wished for even more leadership. You are really leading the way. We have made commitment to the market that we will invest in about $50 billion towards 2030 in renewable and low carbon. And you know, with the policy signals and the policy actions, which is even more important in UK, it stimulates our engagement here. And we believe that UK is a destination for a good chunk of that investment, provided that the business model works. So that is why we are doing quite a lot of projects in UK, both on renewable and on low carbon. And on low carbon, just to mention some of the key projects, we work together with SSE to realize low carbon projects in Humber and Peterhead. We are developing the H2H Salton project in Humber, which is a 600 megawatt blue hydrogen facility, setting up the Salton Chemical Park for fuel switching. We have additional plans for 1.2 gigawatt of hydrogen production capacity to fuel Kidby power station. We are part of the Net Zero Teesside project, and last but not least, in the Northern Endurance Partnership, which is the CO2 transport and storage solution that will serve both Teesside and Humber. We are also part of that, and that's a very important asset, as it actually is an enabler for the transition of Teesside and Humber to become low carbon. So I think I spent my minutes already, so thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Torbjørg. We've actually got some questions coming in now asking about other countries that display best practice in regards to CCUS, so perhaps we can pick that up when we come to the Q&A shortly. But finally, I'll hand over to you, John, for 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to the panel. I'm delighted to be here with such an esteemed group. Ultimately, I'm the Director of Development for SSE Thermal, and we in SSE are a leading energy company in the UK, and we're focused very much on net zero and low carbon infrastructure and solutions. We're investing around $7.5 billion in that over the next 5 years in offshore wind and also in carbon capture. SSE Thermal's role in this, well, ultimately we provide for flexible and backup power generation for those periods when renewables are not on the system. And we plan in SSE Thermal to decarbonize this flexible power and to provide the security of supply through both carbon capture and storage and hydrogen solutions. And the way we're doing this is ultimately we've closed all of our coal plant and we're taking off our old plant over the next period of time. And what we are looking to do is redevelop that plant with new gas-fired power generation, which can ultimately abate through carbon capture and ultimately hydrogen as well. And we're doing that because it keeps the lights on. We're working with Equinor through this process, as Torbjørg has said, and we're developing low carbon plant at a number of locations across the UK. So our projects in the CCS arena, where we're ultimately a CO2 emitter and looking to capture that carbon for further storage, are focused around the Humber area and our KP3 project, which is a CCS project, and a similar sister project up in the northeast of Scotland at Peterhead, where we're developing Peterhead CCS project, ultimately in similar timelines. And with the right policy, we believe these projects are deliverable by mid-decade. They ultimately will be able to facilitate the capture of around 3 million tons of CO2, which is effectively 30% of the UK's target, the UK government's target, out to 2030. So they're projects of scale. For us, CCS also paves the way for low carbon hydrogen opportunities as well. And again, with Equinor, as Torbjørg has indicated, we're working on some of the first 100% fueled CCGT and hydrogen fueled blending plants at our KP facility as well. And we're also working with Equinor on our hydrogen gas storage facility. We already have a gas storage facility in East Yorkshire, and we're looking at transitioning that facility for a hydrogen economy of the future. And these types of infrastructure, these large demand sites of scale and hydrogen storage facilities, they ultimately underpin a hydrogen economy, and they make possible, you know, the twin track approach for further hydrogen development through electrolysis and other means. But we're doing this all in partnership. We don't do this alone. We are working ultimately with Equinor on the emitter side of things, but we're also working with the partners in the clusters. And that's really important, and Lord Duncan touched on that as well. It's a huge part of this, the complete alignment of lots of different sectors to see this vision. Our hope is that with COP26 just around the corner, that the UK government has a wonderful opportunity there to lead and to demonstrate leadership in this space, utilising the great resources that the United Kingdom has in relation to carbon storage. So hopefully it gives you a context of SSE in the CCS space, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion this morning. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks very much, John, and thank you for that overview of SSE, its operations in the CCUS space. We will move to Q&A now. I have got a couple of questions coming through, and I think I'll start with this one, which I'm going to put to you, Torbjørg, which asks, what other country demonstrates best practices in regards to CCUS?
If you look at the projects in operation on a world basis, I'm not sure, I think it's around 20, more than 20 projects. You will find most of them in the North America, because there you can do it onshore, which is of course more cost efficient than doing it offshore. But some nations doesn't have that option, and that's apply for the European nations. There's a lot of learning from there, and then we have the Norwegian projects that are key, I would say. So yeah.
Sure, thank you. And if anybody else wants to step in to answer a question, then please just flag that with me. We do have another question here from Matthew Janet, and I might put this question to you, John, and then to Lord Duncan, which asks, what are the barriers to leveraging private investment in CCUS, and how can these be overcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose from our perspective as an emitter looking to deploy CCS technology to our sites, first of all, we're ourselves investing heavily in this as it is. We're pushing projects through planning, and we're putting projects through FEED, and we're delighted to do that. But I suppose one of the key focuses for us as we deploy capital in this area is ultimately clarity around business models and targets in terms of delivery. Now, the UK government have been helpful in the power CCS space in terms of the facilitation of dispatchable power agreements and business model, DPA business models, and in that regard, and ultimately giving us a clear target in terms of 10 million tons of CO2 capacity to be stored by 2030. So there's some of the key things from our perspective that helps us deploy capital.
Sure. Lord Duncan, would you have anything further to add on John's comments in relation to barriers to leveraging private investment into CCUS?
Well, I think, as I said in my own remarks, the stability of the framework in which the investment can actually take place. What you don't want to do is spend a significant amount of money to create the infrastructure and then discover that the pricing itself, for whatever reason, just simply doesn't add up. And at that point, you either have almost a stranded asset or a need for government intervention. And the chances of government intervening right now in certain areas are really quite limited. So I think one would hope that out of COP will emerge very clear support for such a global framework for CCS, both in terms of the technology, sharing best practice, and also in some ways giving confidence to the wider community that might have concerns or issues with it, so there can be a greater attempt to explain. And in so doing, again, talking regularly with governments to understand when governments themselves believe they will need to do more, because the UK government, for example, is still talking about there being a significantly serious future for the oil and gas sector. But you can't really talk about that without talking about CCUS at some scale, and there needs to be some clue as to what that support might look like, and it needs to be given in good time to allow would-be investors to recognise that it is worth the investment. And at the moment, not all of those pieces are on the board.
What do you think that investment framework should look like, though? Because obviously in the Energy White Paper, it talked about modelling it on a contracts for difference framework, which will be finalised next year. But I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Contracts for differences work well for renewables. There's no question about that. But trying to apply that model just by rolling it across to the hydrocarbon sector, into the CCUS, I don't think it's going to be quite as straightforward. And the government now owe the industry an operational plan, something that says this is how it will actually work in practice. It isn't enough simply to say contracts for difference have worked before, they'll work again. What are you worried about? Get your wallet ready and we can start moving forward. I think greater clarity is required on exactly what structures will be put in place, what framework will be available for this, and what confidence you can have that this will actually be the adequate investment to basically kickstart what, in essence, in the UK is still a very nascent industry, or a nascent contribution to an industry. So there needs to be, more government up front, being much more frank, much more clear. Without that clarity, I think a lot of people will wait. They'll wait and see what is available before they begin to do that. And that then therefore just kicks it into the longer grass for that bit longer. Even if there is an appetite, the government have a serious responsibility to go beyond simply stating high-level mission statements. They require very clear operational plans. And I'm not sure that's there yet.
Thank you, Lord Duncan. We've got another question here from Daniel Cooper. Grazia, I might put this question to you, and then I'd welcome the rest of the panel's thoughts as well. So Daniel Cooper asks, what do we do when we run out of space to store captured carbon? Isn't this a short-term solution, and shouldn't we be looking at more long-term solutions?
To store CO2?
Yes.
Yes, I think that it is important to store CO2 in the long term, but I think that it is important to use CO2 in the long term too, because I think that these are two main components of the same topic, because you can use CO2 for the production of fuels as methane, methanol, and this avoid to you to emit other CO2 in the air. So you can use CO2, avoiding the emission of additional CO2. And but it is important to store CO2 at the same time, because you cannot reduce CO2 for the fixed amount, for the required amount, only by using it. So it is important to store CO2 in the long term. But at the same time, it is important to use it to avoid the additional emission in the air.
Thank you,
Maybe
Grazia.
I could add a bit on that. So yes, thank you. Now, just storage capacity, I'm not concerned about that. Storage capacity, I would argue that is not a limitation. There's a lot of storage capacity, both in the North Sea and even larger capacities identified elsewhere in the world. But I think what is important is to qualify it. I mean, they are identified, but you need to develop them to make and really qualify them and make them ready for injection. So that's what is on the kind of the critical line at the moment. So we need to work on many storage sites in parallel, but the storage capacity itself, it's not a limitation. If you look at the North Sea, it's 200 gigaton. So it's a lot of storage capacity, but we need to qualify it. And we have a good basis to do that because we have a lot of good data from the oil and gas business.
John, I'm not sure whether you had any further comments there, or we'll move to the other questions otherwise.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Torbjørg is saying there in Grazia, like I think from our perspective, what CCS and CCUS provides for ultimately is deep abatement quickly. It provides for large-scale decarbonisation of really challenging sectors, quickly. And appreciating what Torbjørg is saying, there is a vast storage resource, but it's also a finite resource, and therefore over the longer term, once these infrastructures are in place, it needs to be managed appropriately.
Thank you, John. We'll move on to some questions that are coming in through Slido. I have a question here from Hugh, who asks, is the sequestration of olivine mineral deposits a viable method to store carbon dioxide? I might put that question first to you, Torbjørg.
I think I will put it to Grazia because I'm not sure if I can answer that.
Grazia.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch that.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
The question is the sequestration of olivine mineral deposits a viable method to store carbon dioxide?
Yes, you can store carbon CO2 with the mineralization because CO2 can react with metal oxides present in geological formation to form carbonates that are stable in the nature, and so it is a storage in the is a way to store CO2, but it is a long process. It requires centuries of years. And the other way to store CO2 is a called in a technical way oil enhanced recovery, CO2 oil enhanced recovery, when you can put CO2 underground and you can recover oil or the methane from the underground. And in this way you can store CO2 and recover oil at the same time.
Thank you, Grazia. I've got a question here from Michael Crompton. I might put this question to you, Lord Duncan. It says, surely CCS can only work by immediate policy reversals, such as ending the 10% encroachment on Greenbelt by builders and their cosy alliance with Westminster.
Well, if that were a condition, you're buggered then, aren't you? Because that's not going to happen. Not in the time you'd want it to happen. You're going to have to work with the grain on this one, and this is where it becomes more problematic. The real challenge going ahead is how to basically align all of the policies so they're all facing in the same direction and can be delivered in sensible ways by a committed government. But if you seek to undermine or cut across these, you end up with a jumble of policies. And even when the policies themselves have good ambitions, there can be real problems. If you look at the EU's policies in terms of climate change, they had so many good policies, but almost each of them would undermine the carbon price. So for a very long time, you ended up with a carbon price that was actually low because the other policies were working and thereby reducing the amount of emission. So I think the challenge you're going to face, and I didn't mean to sound very blunt about it, but it is this notion that if you ask a government to completely reverse a thing, then it will take a lot longer to do that. If, on the other hand, you seek from the government for it to change direction, think of it like changing the direction of a ship. It will take that bit longer, even if it should be fast, even if you want it to be faster. In fact, even if the government wants it to be faster, changing these policies can take quite some time. Working with a grain of government is the best thing. And one could argue that there could be changes of government, but even then, the policies quite often at the macro scale don't change that significantly.
Thank you, Lord Duncan. I've got another question here from an anonymous user, which asks, as it currently stands, approximately how much will it cost to capture 1 tonne of CO2 from a CCGT station? John, would you be in a position to answer that question?
Yeah, well, I suppose what we're looking at when we look at CCS on a CCGT station is, you know, we're looking at a multiple in terms of what we've already committed in terms of like our KP2 stations. So it is a significantly enhanced commitment, both in terms of CapEx and in terms of OpEx. But as Lord Duncan has been indicating, that as carbon price rises over time, we're ultimately in a position to see CCS becoming much more cost effective. And I suppose from our perspective, and the reason why we're involved in CCS development on power generation, is ultimately we see it solving in many respects the energy trilemma from a power perspective, because we need security of supply. We have to provide a firm and flexible backup generation to deal with those periods when renewables are not on the system. But we also have to do that in a manner which is sustainable. And our view is, and I think it's the view shared more widely as well, that Power CCS can provide the quantum of capacity required in this period, ultimately in a manner which is providing value for money for consumers.
Sure, thank you, John. I've got another question here, another anonymous question. And actually, I think this speaks to your point, Lord Duncan, that you made in your introductory remarks. It says, how influential will public opinion be in the rollout of CCS, especially as it is offshore in this country, which surely reduces the arguments for NIMBYism?
Yes, informed public opinion, I think, is the key element here. Public opinion itself can be, as we've discovered in so many areas, easily moved. I would argue, for example, at the moment, Extinction Rebellion may be doing harm to their wider cause by some of their methods. And public opinion is a fickle thing, it can be moved around. Offshore is certainly out of mind. Odd things happen at sea. I suppose you could argue that people might be more content with that. But I think there would still have to be a recognition of the value of the technology and its safety and various other elements. And public opinion equally, there needs to be a way of broaching this subject, which is that CCS is a means to prolong the wider fossil fuel extraction, which again then would run counter to other aspects of public opinion. So I think the public need to be better informed about certain areas, but as we've heard before, experts aren't always trusted. And part of the dilemma for the public opinion is how then does the public become aware? And quite often it's by a media that has little understanding of science, quite often, in its broadest sense. If you look at the background of most journalists, frankly, politicians as well, very few have any background in science at all. And words are used which simply are just not understood. And I think that part then is another aspect of where the industry has to be more savvy in making sure that they have got people who can understand and journalists who can speak and use the right language and give confidence. But public opinion will be interesting to watch post-COP, because then we'll get a sense of whether people are just exhausted, COVID's really just zapped their strength and they're just weary, or whether there is a renewed energy for another global crisis? We've moved on from the health crisis. Are we now ready to tackle the climate crisis? I wonder. I don't know what public opinion is ready for now. And I watch with interest, and I will be curious to see whether the UK public opinion matches or indeed informs the wider global public opinion.
Yeah. Can I just add?
Certainly,
just
sure.
build on what Lord Duncan just said. BASE just recently had this report on public consultation where they explored public perception, and it's very much confirming what we just heard now from Lord Duncan. And one of the findings was that when people became more confident about CCS, what it is, more familiar with the technology, then opinion changed. And I think it is so important to use language that is different. I mean, only from my own experience, when I speak to my friends, I mean, it's very hard to get them interested in what I'm working with. They cannot associate it with windmills or solar panels. This is harder to explain. And so we need to be much better in explaining it in a simple way. So that's, I think that's a challenge for everyone working with CCS.
John, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just building on that, Torbjørg, I suppose from the perspective as well as that the likes of SSE, we've been working within the clusters that are ultimately looking to unlock the CO2 emitters and facilitate the CO2 storage. And the reality is there that, over a short period of time, there's likely to be huge opportunities in these clusters, but ultimately there'll be change, and there'll be multiple projects ongoing in certain regions, both in terms of transitionary projects from an emitter perspective and potentially new projects through the storage side of things. And whilst I think the industry and the sectors within these clusters have been working incredibly well and incredibly closely, there's also a responsibility on the large emitter projects and the storage projects to work together to inform the public and to inform all stakeholders in a manner that's not piecemeal but is coordinated, so that public can understand, particularly those that are living in proximity to these facilities, how each part of the puzzle fits together. And I think that's something that started well, and I think it's something that needs to be ultimately maintained and continued as we move through this process.
Thank you, John. We've got a question here on Twitter from Melanie Shadbolt, which asks, how great is the risk of leakage, such as from pipes breaking, and how is this risk managed? Torbjørg, I might go to you first on this question, and then Grazia, if you have anything further to say, then please do share your thoughts.
So we have to do our job in the engineering phase to make sure that it is designed properly. When it comes to CO2 compared to hydrocarbon, there is a different property that we need to take into account, which is called, it's what you have this phase transition. When CO2 goes from a liquid phase to a gas phase, it's extremely cold, and it can lead to another type of rupture on the pipeline. So this is something you have to take into to design, either by having a thicker pipeline or by having a what is called something that stops it. So it has to be taken into design. So that has to be done in a proper way. Also maybe it's important when you design any system, you need to kind of take into consideration what are you designing for. And CO2 is very different from hydrogen, but also many times it's in a way not easier is the right word, but hydrocarbon, remember, is can ignite. CO2 cannot ignite. So it's very different. So you have to kind of design for the medium that you actually are transporting.
Grazia, I'm not sure if you had any further comments to add on that question.
Yes, I agree with the previous said. I want to just to add that it is important to design properly the project, and losses of CO2 are also during the storage. So it is important to design in the best way the storage and the transportation. And to this problem, for example, there are some solutions to build the utilization storage near the capture site. For example, the direct air capture allows you to minimize the transportation of CO2, avoiding then the losses of this gas.
Thank you, Grazia. I also have another question for you, which has just come through on Slido from Gary, who asks, can you differentiate between CCS and direct air capture in terms of quantity and energy cost of the CO2 that can be captured?
The direct air capture is an emerging technology. Then it has a higher cost and a higher energy consumption compared to conventional CO2 capture and conventional systems. For example, the energy ratio between the two systems is about 3 for 50% of recovery of CO2 recovery. Then this means a higher energy consumption for the SE system. These are because the CO2 parcel pressure in the air is very low, so it requires a higher airflow rate for the separation and to have a good amount of captured CO2. This high airflow rate means a big equipment for CO2 capture, so a bigger size compared to the conventional system. This means higher cost and higher energy consumption. For the cost, also, DSE is an emerging technology. Then it is under research now. Then it is sure that it has a higher cost compared to a conventional process that it is studied for more years.
Thank you, Grazia. I've got a question here, which I might put to you, John, and Lord Duncan as well, from Michael Taplow, who asks, what will the impact be on consumers, for instance, given this is an expensive technology? Will our electricity bills increase? John, I'll go to you first on that.
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, I suppose, you know, at the outset, you know, organizations like ourselves, we're putting a lot of investment into this infrastructure and this type of development. And that has been met by government support, and there's no doubt that government has facilitated through processes like the ISCF fund to help, you know, with the initiation of this industry. And I think that's important, because when you're at the very outset, you know, you've no clear direction in terms of business models and no clear direction of how investment can be recouped. Ultimately, in terms of from a consumer perspective, you know, as we move to more abatement solutions and look to decarbonize energy, you know, that has to be met with ultimately consumer support. But the way we look at it is very similar to renewable and offshore development. So offshore and renewable wind, it started off at quite a high price point. With supply chain engagement and with scale, costs decreased, and they decreased rapidly. And I think the United Kingdom, through its support of offshore wind, you know, has been a leader worldwide in terms of the facilitation of price reduction through projects of scale. So we see carbon capture and storage as similar. The initial projects will require support. but with scale, with supply chain support, and with real industry delivering, it will ultimately come down in time.
Lord Duncan, I wonder if you could, if you had any additional thoughts on that. Do you think that government support is going to be needed initially to sort of lessen the blow on the impact of consumers? I'm just speaking in reference to Michael's question here around the impact on consumers, given the cost associated with CCUS and whether or not consumers' electricity bills will increase.
Almost any change brings with it cost. I think that is true. The question is, who meets the cost? Will it be the government, and therefore you meet the cost through your tax payment, or will it be you, the consumer, meeting it through your bill? The government has to be able to balance out what is an industry, the oil and gas industry, which will change and will change fundamentally, and almost certainly within a generation will look quite different from what it does now, and with the jobs that it supports therefore also changing. So government has to think about that side of the equation, whilst also thinking about the energy balance, and that is where shall we generate our electricity from? And of course, it's very difficult when you turn on your lights to know exactly where your electricity was sourced. I mean, you don't normally get to know what that is unless you actually ask for that information. So I think the question is whether the bills themselves will go up, and that will be a question where, as we're seeing now, you know, the volatility in the market can drive bills up. If we are simply, you know, on the gas grid, we normally would think that would stabilize, but again, we've seen reasons for that. I think there will be a greater challenge for government to make sure that people are not priced out of keeping themselves warm. And so governments will need to be very alert to what bills look like. And there are different ways of doing it. There has been an attempt to cap overall, but industry doesn't like caps for obvious reasons. Support for those who are at the most vulnerable end of the spectrum is important, but trying to work out how to deliver that. And there's also that group that are vulnerable but not as vulnerable, and they also need support. So I think there will be real challenges going ahead, and it will be when you start looking at the share that energy occupies in your household bills. I think it will go up, even if in the longer term it does come down. I think it will go up.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Mackenzie Dewar in relation to jobs. I think the government's own estimates show that CCUS has the potential to create 50,000 jobs. But the question is asking, how many jobs does CCUS have the potential to create, and will we need to retrain and upskill the workforce for these roles? Lord Duncan, perhaps if you want to come back onto that question, and then John, I might go to you as well.
It will create jobs. I think that is true. And as a minister, I was always surprised when they would give figures for that, because a lot of it was really quite speculative. How will you calculate what jobs will be there in 10 or 15 years' time? And you know, how sustainable will those jobs be, and how long will they last? And then the other part, which they were never very keen to put in, was how many jobs will be lost as a movement toward these jobs from the other areas in which are affected, and so on. I think you could see significant employment if this is delivered at scale. I think the skills are there, and I think they can be deployed. I think there will need to be reconfiguration. It's not just simply a question of putting on a different uniform the next day and you're off to do a completely different role. But I do think one of the tests for a government is whether the jobs are created in the same places. And that's more interesting. So if you see the northeast of Scotland, which has experienced decline in terms of its overall employment in the wider hydrocarbon world, where shall those jobs then be? Will they be in, for example, the northeast of Scotland, or in those parts of Norway which are most affected, or not? And I think government's jobs in trying to manage that transition between where people are currently employed and where they will be in the future is actually much more difficult. Because again, the hope is always that the person who loses a job simply gets another one in exactly the same sort of area. That's all very well, as long as that same sort of area is literally the same geographical area. It's more difficult if it isn't. Otherwise, you have the challenge of family, schools, connections, and so forth. But I do think there will be more jobs. I think handled well, there will be good jobs. And handled sensitively, they should be in the right place. But government does need to think about this carefully to help the sector develop in the right way to deliver that. I think a lot of these figures are actually headline grabbers, but you need to drill straight down into them to understand exactly what they mean to the individual who's currently got a job who's fearful they may not have it for 10 years more.
John, just talking about jobs, and obviously Lord Duncan has just spoken in reference to the government's 50,000 figure. Does the industry have its own estimates as to how many jobs are going to be created through CCUS?
Yeah, so I suppose speaking from an emitter perspective and from our own perspective in terms of carbon capture on power plants, we're very clear that CCS provides two separate opportunities. Firstly, there is the means of maintaining existing jobs. So we're very focused on a just transition from our own perspective in our own organization from what are carbon intensive generation through to a much more carbon efficient means of generation, and bringing our workforce in those locations through with us on that journey. I suppose the broader cluster perspective, it affords the opportunity for new green investment. So for organizations to start to invest in new infrastructure in those locations, as well as ultimately advancing sites that are already there. And we've done a good bit of work in this area in terms of from our existing KP2 facility, which we're building in North Lincolnshire. Ultimately, that when we look at the overall aspect of that project, not just through the construction phase, where there are numerous jobs during the construction phase, but that is for a peak in time. We look at the overall operational phase. There's significant jobs supported through both on-site and in the locality of such projects, and ultimately through the whole operational phase, more broadly through the wider UK, there's a significant portion of the gross value add of that project remains within the UK, even beyond the construction phase. So we see it as a really good opportunity for bringing jobs and maintaining jobs in the regions.
Can I also just add a comment to that? And I definitely support what's been said. I mean, CCS and low carbon project, from a nation's perspective, it definitely, support that new jobs are created, but as also pointed out, existing jobs are protected. And that is a driver for UK and also for Norway. We are also doing, some groundbreaking work in Norway on this. And I would like to mention the Northern Lights project, which is it's part of the Longship project in Norway, where government has supported the development of a flexible CO2 transport and storage chain. So actually, the Northern Lights project can offer a transport and storage solution to industries in Europe that want to decarbonize and then bring that CO2 by ship and store it in Norway. So the project is under construction, will come into operation just in 3 years from now, 2024. And the thing I wanted to highlight was that we see that this infrastructure attracts new industries. They want to co-locate in the area close to the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. So then they can kind of have access to this, getting rid of their CO2. And in Norway, you also have clean electricity, which is also another good access for new industry. So that's just an example that is attracting new industries. So I just wanted to bring that as an example.
Thank you, Torbjørg. Grazia, did you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to say that more jobs could increase the social acceptance of these systems, CCUS and CCS systems. And also the creation of green jobs is one of the sustainable development goals of United Nations. So it is important, this aspect.
Thank you, Grazia. I'm just conscious of time. We have gone slightly over the hour, so I think I will draw things to a close here. We have answered most of the questions, which is fantastic. So Lord Duncan, John, Torbjørg, Grazia, thank you very much for your time and for speaking with us today. Just as a shameless plug for our viewers, you can watch the next one of our Looking Ahead to COP event series, which we are hosting next month on nuclear energy. And if you are in London, we are having a conference on Tuesday looking at biodiversity decline and climate change with a keynote speech from Lord Goldsmith. And if you are interested in attending, you can sign up to that conference by visiting our website, brightblue.org.uk. But thank you very much, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.